Okay, in this video, we're going to cover communities and ecosystems, but we're specifically going to be looking at food webs and food pyramids. So a lot of this you've already seen before, and a lot of this terminology we've already studied, so hopefully it's not too crazy. So you're going to need to draw and label a food web, but you're going to hold off on that because you're going to use a game and a website after we talk on Zoom in a bit to get all the different species that you are going to pull together to draw for your food web. You need to talk about how energy is lost along your food web, and you have to then be able to represent a food web actually in a pyramid. I'm trying to draw that energy pyramid to scale. We're going to talk about the limitations of energy pyramids and what conversion ratio means in food production systems and how that relates to sustainability. Okay. So let's take a look at what we got going on here. If I can find a way to open it up. Okay. So when we're looking at a food web, in a food web, I'm going to move myself over here so you can see this full food web. So in a food web, most species are actually going to occupy more than one level, more than one trophic level. And if you remember trophic levels, we have producers, then we have first level consumers, second level consumers, third level consumers, fourth level, so on and so forth. They don't, in aquatic ecosystems, they can get pretty high, but in ones on land they tend to only make it to the third or fourth level consumers because there's only so much energy gets lost along the way as heat. Okay, and when you're looking at a food web, it's basically a whole bunch of different food chains put together, but they're all sort of intertwined. And you already know how to do the food chain and label the food chain and look at how energy is lost because of cell respiration and that conversion from one form of energy to the other, and it ultimately gets lost as heat. But what you should be able to do is construct a food web if you know who eats what in an ecosystem. And you should be able to label it with all of the trophic levels that each one occupies. And you should also be able to identify which trophic levels an organism occupies if you're looking at a food web. So, for example, if I were to ask you, what's the highest trophic level that the elephant seal occupies? Could you tell me what that is? So go ahead, hit pause, and I want you to see if you can figure out its highest trophic level. Okay, now that you're back, let's see if we can count them. All right, so here the phytoplankton is the producers, okay? And then we're gonna move our way up to first level consumer, second level consumer, third level consumer, fourth level consumer, fifth level consumer, sixth level consumer. So this elephant seal can be as much as a sixth level consumer in this trophic level. Now it doesn't just occupy the sixth level. It could be as little as, here's the producer, first level, second level, third level as well. So it occupies a whole bunch of different positions in this food web. When you're doing your food web, that you're going to use some organisms from a game you're going to play in an ecosystem, you're going to need to make sure that you label each of the organisms with all of the trophic levels that they occupy. So you would put all the different trophic levels for the seal and all the different trophic levels for the fish and so on and so forth. Okay. If you were to represent your trophic levels in a pyramid, whenever you're doing an energy pyramid, you want to make sure you're kind of thinking about that 10% rule, right? So we lose 90% of the energy to heat as we go from each of those trophic levels. And so if you were to ever draw one, make sure you're pretty consistent with your scale. So you want to make each level about 1/10 smaller than all of the others. Your unit should be in kilojoules per meter squared per year. I realize that that's not the case in my example here, but essentially what you're looking at with energy, like if we're looking at the productivity, that is how much energy is produced in 1 square meter of that ecosystem in 1 year. Okay, so it's a flow of energy going through that ecosystem. If you were to also, in some of the questions to consider, you want to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of these pyramids. Now, using the pyramid is helpful in letting us know how much energy is being transferred between between the trophic levels in an ecosystem. They don't always have this 10% rule, right? So if we had a pyramid, we could get a better idea of each one. Now this one's a 10% rule, but maybe it's an aquatic one and it's more efficient than the 10% rule because aquatic ecosystems tend to be a little bit more efficient in their transfers. So it might be, 5%, or I take that back. More efficient would be more than that. It might be 20%. It might be 25%. It just depends on where it is. All right. And also each trophic level might not have the exact same energy transfer efficiency. The other thing that's important too when you're doing a pyramid is that not all the organisms occupy the same trophic level. So where would you put that elephant seal? Would he be on, in the third or the fourth or the fifth or the sixth level consumer in that pyramid? So when you're looking at the limitations, where do you put omnivores, things that eat at more than one trophic level, where, it might not always be the exact same, transfer between the different levels. And then also, how do you collect that data? It's pretty easy to collect the data for plants because you can take their biomass and measure it over a year's time. But to be able to figure out the energy in all these other organisms, you pretty much have to capture and kill them. So we tend to use estimates based on charts of knowledge. Okay, so I'm pretty sure, there's one more thing we have to do. We have to look at the conversion ratios in sustainable food production practices. Okay, so what a conversion ratio is how many grams of food you have to feed an animal, and then how many grams you get out of that. So if you feed an animal, 100 grams of something, how many grams are you going to get out of meat that you can then sell and eat? So in this example, you can see that for salmon, you have to feed them 1.2 grams of food. 1.2 grams of food for every gram of salmon you'll get out as meat. So it's pretty efficient. Whereas something like beef, 8.8. So you have to give a cow 8.8 grams of food to be able to get 1 gram of beef out of it. And so when you're thinking about the efficiency of that, it's not very efficient because you have to give it a whole lot of food to only get a little bit of food out of it. So you have to grow all that food, take up all that space and land to grow the food that you're going to feed to the cow. And so when you're selecting food, if you're trying to be sustainable and you're still eating meat, you want to think about organisms that have a pretty efficient food conversion ratio. And of course, you can see that eating lower on the food chain, if you're a vegetarian, you can get a lot more energy out of the same amount of land and to feed people than you could if you were to feed all that energy from this amount of land to these cows first and then to the human. So if it's like 10%, right? So you get a lot more energy, worthy energy, if you're just eating at that first consumer level.